Chapter 10 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 10. The Old Trapper's Cabin. "How are we going to get this game all the way to camp?" demanded Giraffe. "Camp?" echoed Davy Jones, beginning to look alarmed as he contemplated the enormous bulk of the bull moose, and then imagined the lot of them tugging and straining every nerve to drag it over the intervening ground. "Now just you hold on there, Davy. Don't begin to feel one of them cramp fits of your coming on, just because we have to work like pack horses," Step Hen remarked. "Ain't never thinking of such a thing," said Davy, stiffening up again. "You just think it's funny, but if ever you got doubled up once, you'd feel for me." In times past the Jones boy had been subject to queer fits that took him all of a sudden, and doubled him up with a severe cramp. When he had one of these he was utterly helpless. They had saved Davy more than a few whippings in school and at home, and in this respect proved very accommodating cramps. But latterly the boys suspected Davy had really outgrown them, and that he was only threatened with a return of the disease whenever there seemed to be some hard work to be done. Possibly his active outdoor life, and that gymnastic desire on his part to do all manner of athletic stunts, had helped get rid of the trouble. "But after all," declared Thad, "I don't think anybody is dreaming of trying to carry or drag the moose all the way to our camp. How about that, Eli?" The older guide, upon being appealed to in this fashion, remarked that they would be foolish to think of such a thing. "We can cut it up right here in the morning," he observed. "I guess you boys like to try a steak from the old bull, and we'll tote some of the meat along. And as for the horns, I can fix them all right. We'll carry 'em in one of the canoes, so's you can show your friends the kind of game we has up here in Maine." That suited Thad just right. He wanted those towering horns very much, and was only afraid there might be some objection to taking them along, for they must weigh quite heavily. So after a while the whole party started back to the camp, where a fire was once more kindled, the night being cool. The guides felt the need of warmth, since they would have no cover over them as they slept. It was some time before the scouts could think of settling down. The glorious success that had attended this first try at game worth while seemed to inspire the entire lot with an eager desire to emulate Thad's example. Why, even Bumpus seemed to partake of the fever to some extent, though he had brought no gun along, and did not claim to be any sort of sportsman. When morning came at last, the oldest guide went over, and started operations on the dead moose. He took off the skin, and secured the horns for the successful hunter, to be preserved as a trophy of the event. Besides this, Eli brought back quite a lot of the best meat. The boys were wild to see what moose steak tasted like, but although it aroused their hunger while it was in process of cooking, still the best any of them could do was to gnaw at their portion, for it was as tough as anything they had ever struck. "That's where we missed it," grumbled Giraffe, after giving up in disgust all efforts to masticate some of his portion. "In what way do you mean?" asked Thad, expecting the other would say he ought to have selected a younger and more tender animal, when supplying food for the camp. "Why," the tall scout continued with a broad grin, "d'ye know, I said we had ought to fetch that little meat chopper our folks at home use, and the rest of you laughed at the idea. Just think, if we had it now, what a fine hash we'd be enjoying every day. That's the only thing I know of that could grind up this tough meat." It was rather later than usual that morning before they got started in the canoes. There seemed so much to do. But in good time these various duties were fulfilled. The guides did not appear at all anxious. They seemed to feel satisfied that before a great while had passed they would get in touch with the party they were following, and meant that the boys in their charge should enjoy some of the Maine hunting on the way. Eli declared that he knew of another fine camping spot ahead, which they would doubtless reach about dark. This was really an old and long deserted cabin, once occupied by a trapper, who had taken his toll of furs in the neighboring streams, where once upon a time all manner of valuable animals were plentiful, from mink, otter, marten, and even beaver, while around the vicinity foxes used to be thick, not to mention wildcats and an occasional panther, and even wolves, though these latter can seldom be found within the limits of Maine at the present day. The boys had had more or less experience in using log cabins for nights' lodgings, and they amused themselves as they pushed on, with reminiscences of events that would always be interesting to them. Of course, there were times when the three canoes were some little distance apart, but again they would come close enough together for the inmates to have shaken hands, had the inclination to do so arisen. At noon they stopped to eat lunch, and give the guides a chance to rest, for the work of pushing up against that current was no child's play. Although the boys were ready to lend a helping hand and spell the guides from time to time, naturally the brunt of the work fell on Eli, Jim, and Sebattis. "Did any of you hear a gunshot a little while ago?" asked Giraffe when the boats came together about the middle of the afternoon. "He keeps on saying he's sure he did," broke in Bumpus, who was in the canoe with the tall boy, making the long and short of it, or both extremes meet, as Bumpus himself often humorously remarked. "But neither Eli nor I caught it. How about the rest of you?" "Nothing doing here," said Step Hen, and all the rest, even the stolid Sebattis, denied having heard anything that sounded like the report of a firearm. "Which way did it seem to come from, Giraffe?" asked Thad, wondering if after all the other could have caught a faint sound that escaped the vigilance of the three guides, and thinking of Mr. Carson, of course, who was ahead somewhere. "Oh, about the way we're going, I reckon," replied Giraffe. "Just seemed to catch the faintest little boom, but Eli said as how he hadn't heard nothing. The wind had died out at the time, but the air was still from the north. I'm right sure it was a gun, even if Bumpus here does say I had an idea, and it was such a new thing it hit me with a bump." The afternoon wore away, and the sun set without their having reached their destination. "Where's your old and comfy cabin?" demanded Bumpus. "I'm tired of sitting here so long, and I guess I'll never be able to get straightened out again." "Huh!" grunted Giraffe. "Think of me, will you? Ain't I near twice as long? Ain't I twisted up in a knot every which way? My legs took to bending so they'll knock my knees together, or else look like hoops. How much you got to complain about, you little dumpling, Bumpus?" "But Eli says we're going on, and that we'll make it not a great while after dark sets in," Bumpus remarked, scorning to enter into an argument with the other on the subject of whether it paid to be long drawn out, or else shut up in a small compass. "Good for Eli, then. We can't get there any too soon to suit me," declared Davy Jones, who was working a paddle in conjunction with Jim, Allen having done more than his share of the work during various periods in the afternoon just past. "Give us half an hour more, and we'll sure get thar," said Eli later on, when the shadows of coming night began to cover the river, and had already swooped down in full force upon the adjacent woods. They paddled along in silence, except when one of the boys managed to splash in dipping, or removing his paddle blade. Those who were new to the work found that they had considerable to learn before they could expect to work as silently as Sebattis, for example. The way the Indian would send the canoe forward with vigorous thrusts, and yet never removing his paddle from the water, and making no sound whatever, was a never-ending source of delight to both Thad and Step Hen. And the latter tried valiantly to imitate his example whenever he took the extra spruce blade in hand. Finally, when the half hour had about arrived at its conclusion, Eli gave the tired voyagers a pleasant shock by suddenly calling out, "Land here!" The three canoes were enabled to find good places to run ashore, by means of Thad's precious little electric torch, which came in handy in scores of different ways during the Maine expedition, and paid for itself time and again. Then, first of all, they found where the cabin lay. Eli seemed to know all about it, and claimed to have spent many a night under the shelter of its still fairly well-preserved roof, though it had been 2 years now since last he was here, for on the previous season he took a party along another trail. Giraffe insisted on starting a little blaze outside. He was always thinking of some excuse for making fires, and in this instance nobody quarreled with him, for they really needed some light in order to unload the canoes, and carry the stuff up to the old cabin. The door would not go more than halfway shut, but outside of this defect, which was not so very serious, since the wintry blasts had not yet set in, the log cabin seemed to offer a cozy shelter for the night. Once they got inside, and Giraffe was set to work again, building another fire, this time in the big fireplace, above which yawned the wide-throated chimney. The cabin had once been quite a pretentious place, in those old days when the builder, perhaps with a trapper pard, spent his time here gathering a heavy tribute of rich pelts from the native furry inhabitants of swamp and river and forest. Its roof was quite high, and the reason for this became manifest as soon as anyone entered, for it was found that there was a loft extending halfway across, and which could be reached by a rude but still sturdy ladder. "Now what in the dickens do you think he ever built that up there for?" Step Hen said, as he started to ascend the ladder, and then, thinking better of it, gave up the idea. "A place to store his bales of dried furs, so Eli says," replied Allen. "You see, being up here for 6 months, constantly gathering in new pelts every day, they increased rapidly, and took considerable space. So, having plenty of room, he just ran that platform halfway across, and 6.5 feet from the floor down here." "Great stunt," remarked Step Hen, but he made no further attempt to ascend to the platform, his curiosity being satisfied. And later on Step Hen shook hands with himself because of that second thought, considering himself a lucky boy, which indeed proved to be the case. There was more or less talking and laughing as they started preparations for supper. The chimney seemed to draw poorly at first, possibly on account of not having been used for so long. When it got warmed up, perhaps it would behave, Eli remarked. Meanwhile there was considerable smoke in the cabin, and more or less sneezing, as well as rubbing of smarting eyes. "Say, what d'ye mean, trying to choke us all, Giraffe?" demanded Bumpus, who looked as though in great distress, as the tears were rolling down his fat cheeks like little Niagaras, Step Hen declared. "And I reckon now you just picked out the greenest wood ever, so's to give us a good dose of this?" suggested Davy Jones, also rubbing his eyes. Altogether the boys were making so much noise themselves that no one could expect to hear anything else. That was the only reason Thad could give later on why the keen ears of Eli or Sebattis had not detected certain things that must have come to their knowledge had it not been for this clamor and rattle of merry tongues. "Anybody think of having some more of that India rubber steak for supper?" sang out Giraffe, still working with the fire, which seemed to be behaving a little better already, and gave promise of being all right presently. "Say, don't everybody shout out at once. Put me down for baked beans first, last, and all the time," declared Bumpus, seeking the vicinity of the door in order to cool his heated eyes, smarting from the pungent smoke. "Hello! Who's rocking the old cabin like that? Let up, can't you, before it goes over?" shouted Step Hen, standing in the doorway for air. Possibly he may have thought it did go over, for just then some great hairy object came tumbling down from the loft, making some use of the ladder, but at the same time landing with a crash on the floor. Then, before anyone could so much as make the first move toward one of the guns standing in a corner of the cabin, this lumbering object hustled over to the half-open door, and bowled through, upsetting both Step Hen and Bumpus in its passage. For a second or two silence followed, and then a tremendous shout broke out. "Great smoke! Did you see it?" whooped Giraffe, jumping to his feet. "Who hit me?" gurgled Bumpus, who had crashed into the wall of the cabin, and was sitting there on the floor, looking dazed. A head was thrust in through the half-open door, and Step Hen shouted: "It was a great big black bear, and he just went and kicked me out of the place, fellers!" End of Chapter 10. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. Chapter 11 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 11. On the Wings of the Night Wind. "A bear!" shrieked Bumpus, struggling to his knees. "And he shoved me around like I was a bundle of hay. Did you ever hear of such nerve?" "Think of what he did to me!" cried Step Hen, entering through the partly open door. "I was just poking my nose out to get a whiff of fresh air, for I couldn't hardly breathe in here, when he sent me a-flying, just like you'd kick for a goal on the gridiron. Guess I covered all of 10 feet, and landed in them bushes out there. Look here, see what I got off'n the old beast?" He opened his clenched hand and exhibited a bunch of long black hairs. Undoubtedly Step Hen must have involuntarily clutched at the bear as they came in contact, and had managed to hold on to these tokens of the collision. Thad was laughing and shaking all over, so were Eli and Jim, and Allan joined in. Presently the whole of them began to see the ludicrous side of the adventure, and even Sebattis was noticed to be grinning. Nobody had ever known him to emit a genuine laugh. "And just to think how near we came to having bear steak for breakfast instead of that old tough moose meat," remarked Giraffe. "Well, that's all right," Step Hen took occasion to say; "but if a feller c'n judge from the way he kicked me, that bear was some tough, too. My! I'd sure hate to put on the gloves with him in a bout. I just had time to turn and look around, when I heard that big bump. Then he jumped me, and out we both went. Mebbe I ain't glad now I didn't keep right on going up that ladder when I started. Just think what a time I'd had up there with him." "Wow, and again I say wow!" snapped Giraffe. "Things seem to be happening right thick and fast now, fellers. This sure is the big game country, all right, and to the good." They were all of one opinion with respect to that. To get one night a lordly moose bull, and by the romantic way of calling, too, and then the very next to run across a big burly bear, was as fine a piece of good luck as any of them could wish for. "Wonder what's comin' along next in line?" remarked Bumpus nervously, as he made sure to get close to the fire, and away from the open door. "Say, you don't think that old bear'd have the nerve to come back here on second thoughts, and try to clean out the whole bunch?" Step Hen queried. "Because I've seen all I want of him. They say 3 times and out, but I reckon it was only once with me, and I went, too." "No, I wasn't thinking of him," Bumpus declared; "but then there might be a few elephants, or rhinoceroses, or camels, or something else hanging around these diggings, waiting to get acquainted. I don't like meeting up with 'em so sudden like. Whiff, bang, and then good bye. Why, it ain't decent to treat a feller that way without being introduced first. And to think that the sly old critter was up there all the time we kept talking and carrying on down here," said Davy Jones, who had come out of the affair with only a skinned knee, owing to striking up against some wood on the floor when he threw himself wildly to one side at sight of the descending bear. "What do you think ever started him moving?" asked Bumpus. "Smoke do it," replied Eli. "The old bear, he lies quiet, not knowin' what to make o' us comin' in here, where he's expectin' to take up his winter quarters; but purty soon, thet smoke it begins to smart his eyes. B'ars don't like smoke, any more'n any animal does; so gettin' frightened arter a while, he starts down the ladder, misses his grip, and lands in a heap on the floor. If I'd been able to get hold of a gun, I'd a guv him his pill; but I guess it'd been dangerous work shootin' in here, with so many around." "Will we ever run across him again?" remarked Step Hen, as he felt all over his body, to ascertain how many scratches or bruises had resulted from the rather hurried way in which he took his recent departure. "I don't mind being fired from a cannon," he continued, as several twinges of pain told him he had not come through the ordeal entirely unscathed; "but I draw the line at being made a football by a scared bear. Wonder he didn't break every rib I have. As 'tis, I wouldn't be much surprised if a dozen or so were fractured." "Well, we'll make you a strait jacket to morrow, and keep you in a plaster cast the rest of the trip," declared Giraffe, chuckling in rare good humor, because, for once at least, he had not been caught up in the little whirl. "Like fun you will," grumbled Step Hen, getting Bumpus to rub his back for him, on promise of returning the favor in kind. "But I think somebody ought to go up and look that loft over," suggested Davy Jones. "How do we know but what it's just full of bears right now? 'Tain't the nicest thing to think such a load's going to drop down on your head any old time. He might upset my coffee when I get to drinking, too." So, to quiet the boys, Jim climbed up, taking the little electric torch along with him. Upon his reporting that all was clear, some of the others also ascended, to see where the bear had been sleeping at the time of their arrival. "Now, if there was only a couple of nice jolly little cubs around, we'd have heaps of fun playin' with 'em," Bumpus suggested, as he too examined the loft, and saw where the bear had been making a soft sleeping place out of dead leaves, that must have drifted in through a hole at the end of the roof. but much too small to let the big beast go out that way. "Cubs, listen to him, would you?" cried Step Hen. "Why, it ain't the time of year for cubs, and if it was, I'd like to see you playin' with any, while the old missus was alive and hangin' round. She'd cub you with a club, worse'n she did me, and don't you forget it, Bumpus. Cubs! Well, what queer things you do see when you haven't a gun." And the way he looked at the fat boy when saying this made Bumpus bristle up immediately. "Don't you call me a thing, Step Hen," he admonished, severely, at which there was a shout from the other. "He admits it all, fellers!" Davy Jones exclaimed. "He puts on the shoe first thing. But then, Bumpus, we know you ain't up on natural history. It's a wonder you didn't say that was a hippopotamus or a crocodile instead of a bear. You're bound to know more about these things before you get back to Cranford again. We'll let it go at that. How's that supper getting on, Giraffe? Anything more I can do to help?" "Anything more?" echoed the cook, disdainfully. "I'd like to know the first thing you've done to help get it. Didn't he say he felt one of them fits a comin' on when we landed here, fellers? And then on top of that, you got so scared by that old bear dropping down on us you couldn't hardly move. I just see you helpin' when you can crawl out of it. The only help you'll give will be when supper's ready for servin', and then it'll be to make way with the stuff good and hearty. I notice you never get one of them cramps right then, Davy. Oh, no. They're right handy things to have in the house, ain't they? I'm going to borrow a few sometime. See if I don't now." In good time the supper was pronounced ready, Eli having assisted in its preparation, for, with 9 hungry voyagers to feed, the amount that had to be prepared made the task no light one. As usual, they made merry while disposing of the food that had been gotten ready. Some of the moose was cut up as small as possible, and made into a palatable stew. Then they had Boston baked beans, and some pretty fair biscuits, which Eli baked in the little portable oven that was carried in one of the boats. Of course, coffee made a part of the supper. At home, possibly few of these lads ever drank coffee more than once a day, and at breakfast at that. But here in the woods, the meal would seem rather tame without the warm cup that every one looked for. "What do you say to stopping here a day or so, boys?" asked Thad. "I've been talking it over with Eli, and he says we couldn't find a better place for game. Perhaps now one of the rest of you may run across a moose bigger even than mine, or Bumpus here stands a chance of meeting up with his friend the bear, who gave him that handshake in passing." "Excuse me," Bumpus hastened to say, "that doesn't mean I object to hanging out in the hotel log cabin as long as the rest of you see fit. But I don't hanker after meeting up with that rude black pirate again. He may be a pretty fine kind of a bear as bears go, but I object to the breed." "Count us all as saying we'll be glad of a break in the journey, Thad," Allan remarked, just then. "Besides, we must be somewhere near where that Mr. Carson is hunting right now, and at any time we might run up against him." Step Hen, Giraffe, and Davy nodded their heads, as though to intimate that Allan voiced the sentiments of all when he said that. "There's the one thing I've got in my mind, and it's this," Bumpus went on to remark. "Now's going to be the time for Allan here to keep his promise to show me a bee tree. He told me that summer was the time to do it, when the bees were on the wing, and he could work his little game; but that he'd try his best to accommodate me any time, once we got up here in Maine." "And so I will," replied the other, smiling at the earnestness with which Bumpus kept talking on that one subject. "Perhaps Jim or Eli here will help me find a tree. If the bees are hived up for winter, then the only way we can do it is to listen when the noonday sun is shining. Sometimes, before the weather gets too cold, the young bees come out of their hole and buzz around, trying their wings. I've found a hive in the dead top of a tree that way." "And got a lovely stock of juicy honeycomb, too, I guess," said Giraffe, making a face to indicate that the subject certainly appealed to him from the standpoint of a sweet luxury, if from nothing else. "Sure we did, and a lovely lot of stings thrown in," chuckled Allan. "Well, they say bee stings are good for rheumatism, and I've sometimes thought I was getting a touch of that in my legs," Davy Jones observed, thoughtfully. "There wasn't much rheumatism about you when that bear dropped down on us," said Giraffe, scornfully. "The way you scooted out of the way would have made the best short distance sprinter turn green with envy. Rheumatism! Wow! That goes in line with cramps, I guess now." "What'll we put all the honey in?" asked Bumpus, just as though he counted the finding of the bee tree an accomplished thing, because Allan had agreed to do what he could to find one. "I'll hold all I can," retorted Giraffe, complacently; "but then you mustn't expect me to keep on loading up till I bust. I can stretch sometimes, but even that's no sign I'm made of injy rubber, is it?" "Well, we won't cook our rabbit till we've got him," said Allan. "Sometimes most of the honey in a bee tree is old, and candied. The new stuff is what counts. The other is dark colored and sickeningly sweet. But wait and see, if so be we're lucky enough to strike one." After supper was over they enjoyed sitting there before the fire, and listening to Eli tell stories about the old cabin; which, according to his accounts, must have seen many queer happenings, at least equal to the one surprise to which they had been treated, on their first acquaintance with it on this night. Thad, being given a fair amount of imagination, found it easy to shut his eyes, and believe he could see the old trapper who once lived here, as Eli described him. Years upon years he had come and gone, as the winters passed, always taking toll of the woods' folks, yet never trying to make such a deep inroad on their numbers, but that there were plenty left for breeding purposes. The wise old trapper looked forward to another year. Finally he had lost his life among the wild loggers of a Maine river, being unfortunate enough to get caught in a jam that he was trying to break. When some of the boys, tired from the work of the day, and lack of rest on the preceding night, stretched out their blankets, and disputed about where each should settle down later on, Thad and Eli stepped out to see what the night promised for the coming day. If it looked like snow, they would find good tracking weather; though for one Thad hoped this would still keep off some little while, and allow them to do some hunting before winter closed on them. The stars were shining brightly in the dark heavens. The young moon had sunk to rest; but every night now they might expect it to grow in size, until in a week considerable light would come from this source. And there is nothing more enjoyable when in the depths of the wilderness than a round, clear moon. As the two stood there speaking of these things, there came stealing on the night air a strange sound that, although rising from a considerable distance away from the cabin, still struck Thad as very weird, and also blood-curdling. He had heard watchdogs bay to the moon, but this was something far more thrilling. "That's no wildcat, and I don't think it can be a panther, a bear, or any animal I've ever struck in the woods. What do you make out of it, Eli?" he asked, turning to the old guide, whom he had heard emit a whistle as of astonishment at the time that queer howl was heard. "It's been many a year now, Thad, since I ever heerd the like of thet howl," the Maine guide observed. "Time was when they useter be here in plenty; but the bounty paid by the state, it jest 'bout cleaned the hull lot out, or else they thort as how 'twar safer up yonder across the line in Canada." "What's that?" exclaimed Thad. "Do you mean to tell me that was a wolf?" "A real wolf, and nothin' else," answered Eli. "And let me tell ye, it do bring back the old days, for me to listen to that howl. This is like livin' again." CHAPter 12. Of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail, by Herbert Carter. Chapter 12. A Face in the Window. "Ugh! That right, Eli. Wolf only cry like that," said a voice close beside the two who stood there; and turning, they could make out a figure which they knew must be that of Sebattis. But so softly had the Indian slipped out, after hearing that well-known though faint howl, that even Eli, sharp ears though he possessed, had not detected his coming until he spoke. "Where thar's one wolf, thar's agoin' ter be more," remarked the old Maine guide, with the air of one who knew what he was talking about. "Huh! Wolf he always hunt in pack, never by self," observed Sebattis dryly. "That adds a little spicy flavor to our being up here, then," Thad went on to say, being not displeased. For if only he could have that magical little rifle of Step Hen's in his hands, he cared not how many of the fierce brutes he might run across; for with its quick shooting qualities, and the deadly nature of the bullets it used, he believed he could take care of all comers. Besides, if hard pressed, it was always possible to take to a tree, where one would be safe from the cruel fangs of the animals. When they went inside and told what they had heard, the boys received the news with various shades of enthusiasm. Giraffe was really pleased, for he meant to do something bold on this trip that would forever establish his reputation as a mighty Nimrod. Step Hen fondled his rifle, and then stood it in the corner close to the spot where he had spread his blanket, as though he had a faint idea he might find need for it in the night. Davy Jones shrugged his shoulders, and hoped he would not happen to run across the pack when alone; and as for Bumpus, he deliberately changed his blanket, placing it on the further side of several others, away from that open door. But Eli had been examining that same door, and was of the opinion that, with a little effort, it might be coaxed to shut. This he proceeded to accomplish, and with a success that won him a cheer from the timid Bumpus. "Never did like to sleep in a draught," muttered the fat scout, "and I'm glad the glass stayed in that window all these years." "That is queer, for a fact," observed Thad. "But I reckon now it would never have held out if some of the fellows we have in Cranford had come along." "You hit it right about that, Thad," agreed Step Hen. "Take that Ambrose Griffin and his cronies, Eli Bangs and Walt Hopkins, and they never could pass an empty house without shying stones at the windows. I've heard a smash many a time, and seen one of them scooting away like hot cakes. Guess they like to hear the jingle of the broken glass. It must sound like music to some fellers." "What's that you say 'bout Eli?" asked the old guide, pricking up his ears. "Oh, we weren't talking about you that time," laughed Thad. "It happens that you've got a namesake down in the town where we live, who's up to every trick there is, that he thinks that will afford him some fun." And as the guide expressed an interest in the matter, Thad detailed a few of the practical jokes which were believed to lie at the doors of the three bad boys of Cranford. When he heard about the lights going out at the church, just when a convert was about to be immersed, and the cries of the alarmed audience, together with shrieks from the frightened woman, who really thought she had been transplanted from this world into another, since everything became suddenly black around her, the guide grinned. He had never heard of such carrying on, and thought it was comical. But Thad knew that more than one person had need of a doctor after that episode, and that if actual proof could be procured concerning the culprits who cut the electric wires, they would have been severely punished by the town fathers. Somehow none of the boys seemed in such a hurry to lie down now. Thad's stories of events which they knew from first hand started them talking again; and by degrees some of the rest related other doings that were commonly laid at the door of the three Cranford scapegraces. Bumpus changed his blanket 3 separate times in the course of half an hour. There was no draught now to complain of, since Eli had managed to get the door closed; but Thad noticed the fat and timid scout eyeing that wide throat of the chimney, and really believed Bumpus had come to suspect that it was large enough to admit of the passage of one of those hungry wolves, should they find all other avenues of ingress closed to them; and he did not fancy being directly in the road of the first one that came in. Bumpus knew that he must prove a juicy morsel for any half-starved beast of prey, and that, given the chance, they were just sure to pick him out. Giraffe was playing safe under any considerations; for the animal that would prefer that bag of bones must be out of its mind. And Thad also made up his mind that after Bumpus got fairly to sleep, he would manage to get possession of the gun he had hitched closer to him, and which was the double-barreled weapon carried into the woods by Davy, who had made no protest when the stout boy coolly appropriated the same. There could be no telling but that Bumpus, with his mind worked up over that bear, and the wolf that had howled away off up the river, might dream he was being hotly attacked. And a gun in the possession of a greenhorn could be even more dangerous under such conditions than if an adept handled it. "I've just thought of a good thing!" suddenly exclaimed Bumpus. "Then get it out of your system in a hurry, or it'll hurt you," said Giraffe. "No danger of anything good ever hurting you, Giraffe," declared the other, with a fine show of sarcasm that caused the tall scout to grin; for somehow, when he and Bumpus got to exchanging compliments, Giraffe always seemed rather tickled if the other managed to give him a sly dig. "Well, let's hear what struck you all of a sudden," he remarked. "It's about our honey," began Bumpus, seriously. "What honey?" demanded Giraffe, pretending to look all around. "I haven't seen any, that I know of." "Oh, you know what I mean," Bumpus went on. "The honey we expect to get when Allan finds the bee tree. I'm just as dead sure he's going to do it, as I am of having my breakfast tomorrow morning." "Well, I reckon Allan only wishes he was as sure as you are," Giraffe remarked. "Let him tell what's on his mind, can't you, Giraffe?" broke in Davy Jones. "I think it's a shame how you badger that poor fellow. Don't you know there's a law against cruelty to animals?" "Monkeys are included under that law, please remember," retorted the fat boy, as he turned on his new tormentor. "But I suppose you fellows are just dying to know the brilliant thought that just flashed into my mind a little while ago." "Go on and get it out," begged Step Hen. "Yes, we want to know, if we're not from Missouri," added Allan. "Well, there isn't any reason why we should waste a whole lot of it after all, if we only knew enough to use our brains, and take advantage of our opportunities," Bumpus went on, with exasperating slowness, as though this might be his method of getting even for the attack upon him. "What sort of opportunities?" demanded Davy. "Storage capacity," answered the other, simply. "Now, it's all very well to want to save the honey," observed Giraffe, eyeing the other suspiciously; "but if you expect us to fill up our kettles, and every dish we've got along with us, you're off your base, Bumpus. We have to eat 3 times a day, and just fancy having even the coffee pot jammed full of sticky sweetness." "Guess again," remarked Bumpus, composedly. "Well, I suppose that I'll just have to tell you, because you'd never get on to such a brilliant idea in 1,000 years. First thing, you didn't know I brought it along, perhaps. Don't hardly understand myself just why I borrowed it from Smithy, but I must have thought it'd come in handy some time or other. And it's going to, fellows, it's going to." "What is?" shouted Giraffe, now at the end of his patience. "Why, that cute little collapsible rubber foot bath belonging to our comrade Smithy. You know he was such a clean feller that he just couldn't think of going anywhere at first without carrying that tub along. It holds quite a lot, and if we filled it with nice, sweet honey—" But poor Bumpus did not get any further in his explanation. Roars of laughter broke in upon his story, for the idea of filling a rubber foot bath with the sticky product of a bee tree was too much for the rest of the boys. And Bumpus, after staring around in a hurt way, shrugged his fat shoulders, and relapsed into silence, simply remarking: "Oh, all right. That's all a feller gets for cracking his brain trying to think up things for the benefit of the whole bunch. I just guess that old bear'll get the main part of our honey, after all." "What's that? Do bears like honey, Allan?" demanded Giraffe. "I should say they did," replied the Maine lad, readily enough. "They're just wild over it. A bear will overturn a hive if ever he gets in a garden, and devour comb and all, like a regular pig." "But the bees," continued the tall scout, "don't they sting him at all? Think of the thousands of little critters, each with his poison lance, stinging that poor bear." "It doesn't seem to bother the bear one bit," Allan added. "I've known them to just clean out a hive. And when we shot the varmint just afterward, he didn't seem to have a swollen head from any stings. But if we should be lucky enough to find a bee tree, perhaps we'll coax our friend the bear that was in this cabin to come around, and then some of you can get a crack at him. His hide would make a rug to be proud of, especially if you had killed the beast yourself." "Count me in on that game," said Giraffe, earnestly. "I boasted to the boys at home that I was going to bag a big bear, and if I don't make good they'll give me the laugh, you see. And then we'll find out whether this heavy old rifle that belonged to my uncle ain't equal to a newfangled little popgun that shoots spreader bullets." The boys had begun to show new signs of quieting down. Some were yawning again, and the chances were the signal to crawl under the blankets would presently have been given by Thad. It was Bumpus who suddenly aroused the whole party. He sat upright on the floor, and pointed directly at the window that was opposite to where he had last thrown his blanket down. Thad saw that the face of the fat boy really expressed surprise, not to mention consternation, as he cried out: "Oh! I wonder who that was I saw peek in at the window just then, and draw back when he caught me looking at him. A white man, too, fellers, it was, believe me, I ain't foolin'." Everybody jumped up, the 3 guides as well as the boys, when Bumpus made this astonishing declaration. But although their eyes instantly sought the window indicated, the cobwebbed glass betrayed no sign of the presence of any one. CHAPter 13. Chapter 13 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 13. The Marked Shoe Again. "He's got 'em again, boys," exclaimed Giraffe in utter disgust. "You know, time was when our friend Bumpus was always seeing things. He used to get us up in the middle of the night hunting around for all sorts of crazy wild beasts; and then, after we'd been nearly frozen, he'd yawn, say he guessed he must have been dreaming again, and turn over to go to sleep. Now he's beginning to see things with his eyes open." Everybody looked severely at Bumpus. Thad knew the ways of the fat boy as well as any one could; and he understood that the other could not keep a straight face when attempting anything like a practical joke. A whimsical little grin would always betray Bumpus to shrewd and searching eyes. But just then he had a solemn look. Bumpus even seemed to be aggrieved that his words should be so lightly taken. "But I ain't foolin', I tell you," he persisted. "I really and truly did see something that looked like a man's face peek in at that window." "Oh, hear him beginning to hedge, would you?" cried Davy, fiercely. "First it was a man, and a white man, too. Now he says it just looked like a man. Pretty soon he'll up and admit that he thought he saw something moving out there, and when we rush out to hunt around, I guess we'll find only the limb of a tree that waves in the night wind." "Oh, you Bumpus, we know you all right." "Oh, very well, if you don't believe me when I say so, and hold up my hand this way, why, I haven't got another thing to say," grumbled the fat boy. "But if I didn't see a face there, why, I'll eat my hat." "After all," remarked Thad, whom the guides had been watching, to take their cue from his actions, "it ought to be easy to prove Bumpus' statement one way or the other." "How's that, Thad?" asked Step Hen. "Why, all we have to do is ask Sebattis here, or Eli or Jim, to step outside and look for tracks," remarked the patrol leader. "Well, what do you think of that for a bright lot of scouts?" laughed Giraffe. "That's what we ought to have thought of the first thing. And the sooner they get busy, the quicker we'll know whether Bumpus saw anything, or just thought he did." Thad turned on the guides, and smiling, nodded his head. With that signal, which they easily understood, both Eli and the Indian darted over to the fire, while the boys watched them curiously. "Oh, it's torches they're after!" exclaimed Bumpus, seeing the guides picking out blazing brands that, to their practiced eyes, offered all the advantages which a lantern might supply. Doubtless one of the three men would have hastened to the door, and pushed out to investigate as soon as Bumpus raised his racket. Only, hearing Giraffe making fun of the fat boy, they suspected it was only a prank he might be playing, and none of them wished to be caught as the victim of a practical joke. The door was somewhat difficult to open, but stout Jim threw his weight upon it, and had a passage for his fellow guides when they were ready to step out. Of course, every one of the scouts hustled after, even Bumpus, which fact seemed to speak well for his sincerity. Thad himself secretly believed that there might be something in what Bumpus had said, and he prepared himself to hear such an announcement from one of the two who were intending to look for signs. The very first thing both Sebattis and Eli did after emerging from the hut was to swing their torches violently around their heads. These made a hissing sound, and this strange action quite aroused the curiosity of some of the scouts. "Whatever are they doing that for?" asked Step Hen. "Looks like they might be signalling to somebody, and saying it's all off," Davy remarked. But somehow Giraffe, knowing all about fires, and what uses they could be put to, laughed at their dense ignorance. "Why, don't you see?" he declared with an air of superior wisdom. "When they whirl 'em around swiftly that way, it starts the flame to burnin' more fiercely, and so they get better light. See, what did I tell you? Ain't they burnin' to beat the band now? Talk about your electric torch, bah! It ain't in the same class with a good live firebrand." Both the Penobscot Indian and the old Maine guide had pushed close up under the window by this time. It was seen that they carefully watched where they were stepping, as though not wanting to interfere with any tracks that might happen to lie there. Bumpus in particular watched their every move, as though fascinated. His veracity had been attacked by his fellow scouts, and he was waiting to see them eat humble pie pretty soon. For a face could not appear at the little dusty window without having connection with a human body, and that in turn could not get there save through the aid of a pair of legs, which would be connected with feet that must leave some sort of trail. No doubt that was the way Bumpus was figuring it out, as he stood back with the others and watched. Eli evidently realized that though he might be an inexperienced hand at all such things as finding tracks and following them, under difficulties that might daunt many men, he could hardly expect to place himself in the same class with a genuine son of the forest. Therefore Thad noticed that the old Maine guide seemed to purposely allow Sebattis to have the leading chance. He might know more than the Indian on many subjects, but was ready to play second fiddle, as Giraffe expressed it, when there was a trail to discover or read. Hardly had the red guide reached the side of the cabin near the window, than he made a slight motion with his hand. Eli had evidently been waiting for some such signal as this. He quickly moved over to where the other bent down, and the two of them seemed to be looking closely at something. A minute later they moved forward a step at a time, and evidently following some tracks that were plainly marked upon the ground. "Huh!" chuckled Bumpus. Only that and nothing more, but the one word contained a world of meaning, and must have given him great satisfaction. Perhaps, had he happened to be next to Giraffe, instead of Thad, he might have given the long-legged scout a sly dig in the ribs, and in this way let him understand that he believed his vindication in a fair way of being made complete. "They've got something, that's sure," declared Davy Jones. "And now they're right under the window, too," added Step Hen. "Guess Bumpus wasn't dreaming after all. He saw a face all right. Look at 'em moving off now. Say, Thad, you don't think they're going to try and follow the owner of that face up till they get him, do you?" "Well, hardly," returned the patrol leader. "I suppose they just want to make sure he did skip out, after he saw Bumpus had discovered him. And that looks like the fellow hardly cared to join our family circle. But who under the sun could he be, Thad?" asked Step Hen. "If there's more or less game around these diggin's, p'raps some trapper's made up his mind to stay up here all winter and take pelts. When he saw our crowd, he was that disgusted, he just pulled up stakes and lit out for all he was worth." "I think you're way off there, Step Hen," declared Giraffe. "Now, if I was asked my opinion, which nobody seems to care shucks for, I'd say that feller might be one of the two guides Mr. James W. Carson took into the woods with him. You see, I reckon there's a heap of jealousy between all these same guides, and it galled him to know that after they'd gone and fetched the gentleman away up here, promising that he'd have all the big game hunting he wanted, without being bothered by any other party, they had to run smack up against a pack of Boy Scouts out on a trip. That's why he scooted the way he did, I say." Giraffe looked toward Thad, as though wishing he would speak up, and either substantiate his opinion, or else advance a new one. But the patrol leader was closely watching the guides, and made no remark. Sebattis and Eli had not gone far away. They seemed to be satisfied with following the trail just a little distance, and then turning, came back. Arriving under the window again, they beckoned the others to approach. "Don't walk over this patch right here, boys," warned the old guide, pointing down close to his feet, and from this they understood that the marks lay there. "It's there, all right, Thad," remarked Eli with a grin. "Seems like the boy, he was right arter all, and some critter was a peekin' in at us." Both Thad and Allan of course looked down at the ground. The guides held their blazing pine knots closer, so that they could see better. The impression of human foot could not be easily mistaken for the track of any sort of wild beast. Even the most ignorant tenderfoot scout that ever joined a troop must have known that fact at a glance. But the patrol leader and the Maine boy seemed to discover something about the imprint of a shoe that caused them to stare. The balance of the scouts realized that something was about to happen beyond the ordinary, for they pushed in closer, and waited for either of the two experts to advance an opinion. Allan looked at Thad, and the other returned his glance with a nod. "Seen that track before, Allan?" Thad remarked. "I sure have, for a fact," replied the Maine lad, positively. "Remember how you found a footprint at that other camp of ours, before the sheriff came along? It had a patch across the sole, and so has this one. So it stands to reason that the same fellow made both prints. And didn't Sheriff Green tell us the leader of those hobo burglars wore a shoe that had just this same crisscross patch on the sole? That looks like we might be somewhere close to that bunch of rascals right now, and that the sheriff must have gone off on the wrong scent." The other scouts listened to all this with wide open eyes, and expressions of both amazement and eagerness. But it was Giraffe who voiced their feelings when he exclaimed, drawing in a long breath: "Wow! And again I say, wow!" End of chapter 13. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson.
Chapter 14 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 14. Figuring It Out. "Told you so," Bumpus could not refrain from saying in triumph. Thad turned on him. "Suppose you let us know what the fellow looked like, Bumpus," he remarked. "If we happen on him in any of our wanderings, it might be just as well that we knew the kind of customer we have to deal with. Can you describe him?" "I'm afraid not, Thad," replied the fat boy a little dejectedly. "You see, just as quick as he caught sight of me turning my eyes up there, he ducked. And all I saw was that he had a face, and a kinder hairy one at that." "Oh, you mean he wore a beard?" asked the other. "Sure he did," was the reply. "That's what made me wonder whether it might have been a monkey of some sort, even if I didn't say as much to Giraffe when he was kidding me. But I happen to remember that ordinary monkeys don't grow up here in Maine." And the suggestive look he shot in the direction of Davy made that comrade sneer, as though he had grown hardened to being classed with the tree-climbing tribe, just because he could hang by his toes from a limb, or go to the tip-top of any tree that he had ever seen. "Well, he came and he saw, but he didn't conquer, not by a long sight," observed Step Hen. "He didn't like our looks one little bit, fellows, and made tracks out of here. What do you suppose brought him around in the first place?" "Mount a bein' just passin', and seein' our light in hyar, thort he'd come to look us up. If he's thet kind of varmint, he maybe thought as how thar was good pickin's to be had. But he knows better now." It was Eli who advanced this opinion. Thad had another one that was based on certain facts obtained from the Maine sheriff, who had dropped in on their camp so unexpectedly. "If that was the man called Charlie Barnes," he said, "you must remember that we heard he used to be a guide up in this country long ago, before he took to his present calling. And in that case, why, perhaps he may have known this old cabin here, and was coming to see if it would make a halfway decent place to stay for a while. Perhaps one of his friends is sick, or it might be they feel that they just have to hold over somewhere so as to lay in a stock of food. That's an idea the sheriff had, I recollect, and he wanted to keep so hot on their track that they'd find no time for hunting, and must get hungry." "Well, it was a man anyway, wasn't it?" asked Bumpus, demurely, for he felt that Giraffe owed him an apology of some sort. "Yes, it was a man," admitted that worthy frankly. "And for once you've got a bulge on me, Bumpus. Rub it in all you want to. My hide's about as thick as the skin of a rhinoceros, and I could stand it easy." "Oh, that's all right, Giraffe," replied the other, ready to forgive now that things were coming his way. "I was only thinking how queer it seems to have them hobo burglars hunting us up. Remember what I said about that fat reward we'd get if we happened to pull 'em in. A big $1,000, Mr. Green said it was, and perhaps double that by now. Well, funnier things have happened, understand, than a pack of brave scouts, tried and true, rounding up a bunch of cowardly hobos. We can do it, fellers, and not half try, if we get the chance." Again Thad thought it was one of the queerest things he had ever seen, to watch how the fire of enthusiasm seemed to burn within the breast of the usually rather timid and backward Bumpus Hawtree. Evidently he had his mind set on that reward, and could see how splendidly it would come in for the patrol in paying the expenses of another long vacation trip they had in mind. "Wonder if he'll come back any more," remarked Step Hen, as they began to move into the cabin again, there being no further reason for remaining out in the cold. "I reckon now he saw all he wanted, and didn't care about waiting to be introduced to such a gang," Giraffe chuckled. "Speak for yourself, Giraffe," remarked Davy disdainfully. "I just can't get over Bumpus here showing such a strong desire to grab these burglar fellers," Giraffe went on. "What's coming over him, do you think? We never used to think him daring or bold. He always said his heft kept him from joining in with the rest of the boys when they skated over a ticklish bender in the ice, and that he'd sure break with him. some way about doing a lot of stunts. Now here is trying to copy after Davy Jones and some of his monkey shines, and making the rest of us look like 30 cents when it comes to wanting to surround these here ferocious hobos and take 'em prisoners." Bumpus shrugged his fat shoulders and tried to look indifferent. "Huh? That's because you never really knew what I had in me," he said, calmly though. Thad could see the merry twinkle in his eyes. "It ain't always the savage-looking feller that turns out a real hero, when the time comes around. Often the quiet, modest, retiring sort of chap jumps in and saves the drowning child." "Oh, that's you, is it?" demanded Giraffe, as he settled himself down in his blanket, ready to try for a little sleep. "Everything seems to be coming my way," replied Bumpus, proudly. "All you have to do is wait for the turn of the tide. I'm feeling just joyful, let me tell you. All but one thing," he added hastily. "If I only knew about that letter business, did I deliver it at the bank, or was I silly enough to forget and lose it? Sometimes I can just see myself walking in through the door of the bank and delivering the old thing. Then it all gets mixed up, and for the life of me, I just can't say one way or t'other. If only one of you remembered seeing me go in or come out, or if I said anything about handing it over, it'd ease my mind a heap now, I tell you." Every time Bumpus got to thinking about that one trouble he lapsed into silence, because he did not seem to get any sympathy from most of his chums, Giraffe and Davy in particular being very apt to taunt him on his poor memory. Step Hen was not inclined to say very much, lest he draw the vials of the fat boy's wrath down on his head, for as we know, Step Hen had a failing himself in the line of forgetting what he had done with things he owned. Once more the boys crawled under their blankets. Each of them managed to manufacture some sort of pillow. One had taken his clothes bag, and this example several of the rest copied, as suiting their wants exactly. Bumpus, lacking enough material, had gone out to the canoe, and brought in his old haversack, from which he had extracted the very rubber foot bath which he had mentioned to his chums as belonging to Smithy. This he crammed half full of other things, and declared it made as soft a pillow as anybody wanted. "Better cover that rubber with a towel, or something like it," remarked Thad. "But this feels so nice and cool," complained Bumpus. "It may now all right, but after a while when you sleep it'll begin to draw like everything, and the chances are you'll look like a boiled lobster on one side of your face by morning. I've been there myself, and know how it smarts and burns." "Thank you, Thad, for the advice, and I'll take advantage of it right away," declared the stout scout, sweetly. "Ain't it the best thing ever to have a chum or two along, like Thad and Allen, who know so many things? Why, if it wasn't for them, the rest of us would look like babes in the woods." "Let up on that chatter, please, Bumpus," growled Step Hen. "It's getting awful late, and we ought to have been asleep long ago." "Yes, button up, Bumpus. I'd rather hear you snore than talk just now," came from under the blanket that Giraffe had wrapped himself in much after the style of a mummy. "All right, just lie on my back then, and try to accommodate you," the other shot back. "I've got one of my shoes handy, remember, and if you so much as give one little snort, I mean to shy it over in that corner," Giraffe threatened. The guides had been talking quietly among themselves, and when Thad saw Sebattis open the door and slip out, he could give a pretty good guess what the Indian meant to do. Perhaps he suspected the hoboes, lacking a boat with which to make their flight easier as long as the river continued navigable, might return in numbers later in the night in order to help themselves from the stock of Old Town canvas canoes owned by the scouts party. Yes, the shrewd Penobscot Indian did not mean that such a disaster should come to pass, and doubtless he and his fellow guides had arranged for sentry duty by turns during the entire night. Thad felt perfectly secure with such wide-awake vedettes to look out for the approach of the enemy. He would have gladly taken his turn on post if asked, but it seemed as though the three guides considered that a part of their duty. They had an easy enough task as it was, with these boys so willing to paddle in turn, make fires, help cook the meals, and do all sorts of things that generally the guide has fall on his shoulders alone. Presently silence fell on the cabin. The fire smoldered on the great hearth, and occasionally flamed up, only to die down again. If it got very low, someone who happened to be awake at that time was supposed to quietly get up and put more fuel on. This had been anticipated, and there was plenty under the shelter of the cabin roof. Perhaps Bumpus believed that Giraffe really meant that dire threat he made in connection with his heavy shoe. At any rate, he did not venture to lie on his back at all, and therefore failed to emit anything that could be called a snore. Hours crept on, and the night wore away. Some of the scouts never woke up once from the time they dropped off to sleep until the delightful odor of boiling coffee gave them to understand that dawn was at hand, and Jim getting breakfast ready for the whole outfit. That caused the last of them to climb out, and there was more or less chattering as they went outside to try to find water that was not icy cold in order to wash their faces, and chase the last remnants of sleep from their eyes. "I wonder," said Bumpus, looking up at the brightening sky, and trying to keep from shivering as he dashed water over his rosy face, "if this is going to be a good day for bee-tree hunting, because I'll never be happy till I've seen what a real honey-hole looks like." "But remember," warned Giraffe solemnly, "we ain't filling our kettles and bathtubs with the honey. I know where a heap of it can be stowed away right now, and that's all I'm thinking about. Hey, there's Jim rattling the frying pan with that big spoon. I reckon breakfast's ready before we are. Get a move on, Bumpus." End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 15. The Luck That Came to Bumpus. "Where's Sebattis?" asked Step Hen, as they sat down to breakfast, there being a rude table in the cabin around which the boys could gather, though the guides had to hold off, and either wait or else munch their food elsewhere. "That's a fact. I thought there was somebody missing!" exclaimed Bumpus. Somehow or other they all looked toward Thad, as though he might be able to give an explanation; and sure enough he did. "Why, he beckoned to me about the time I came out," the scoutmaster remarked, "and told me he was going to take a little turn along the trail of that man. He hasn't come back yet, so I guess he's been able to follow it some distance." "That sounds real woodsy now," declared Giraffe, "following the trail for me. I'm struck on everything that seems like Cooper's Leatherstocking. Wonder whether he can keep it right up till he drops in on the crowd. Perhaps they ain't so very far away from here after all. But I just saw Sebattis pass the window. There he is, coming in right now," observed Step Hen. The dusky-skinned guide was indeed entering the door, and no one could tell by looking at his inscrutable face whether Sebattis had met with success or disappointment in his recent labors. From the fact of his coming back so soon, Thad rather imagined that the latter must be the case. He knew the Indian would volunteer no explanation unless asked questions, and so Thad managed to corner him while he was fixing his elkskin moccasins over by the fire. When presently the patrol leader came back to the rest of the scouts, he was greeted by numerous demands that he communicate what he had learned. "Sebattis followed the tracks for some distance," Thad went on to say, as he poured himself another cup of coffee. "But after the fellow got a certain distance from the cabin, he began to be more cautious. It was just as if he thought some one might want to follow him, and he did not mean they should succeed. At any rate, he covered his tracks so that even Sebattis was unable to find the trail again." "Then it's sure a fact that the hobo must be some woodsman himself," Giraffe declared. "I thought an Indian could follow the trail of a fox if he wanted." "Well, Sebattis said he was willing to go back again and try further, and that he believed he could find the trail again; but he wanted to make sure first that we cared enough about it. From certain remarks he had heard some of us make, he thought we didn't care to make the acquaintance of the rascals. We even said, you may remember, fellows, that we hadn't lost any hoboes that we knew of, and didn't mean to go out of our way to find any. And so Sebattis came back to report." "What did you tell him, Thad?" asked Step Hen. "Why," replied the other, "that so long as they didn't interfere with us, we had no reason to bother our heads about these men. We had plenty of things on hand, as it was, without trying burglar catching. If they only let us alone, and didn't run across our path, we'd forget there were any such chaps in the Maine woods. Just think of the lost chance to lay in a big wad of the long green, enough to carry us all the way across the continent and see something of the far West, like we've often talked about," whined Bumpus. Tad was indeed surprised to hear the fat boy talk like this, for Bumpus was, as a rule, a very peaceful boy, never willingly seeking trouble. Really, this anxiety in connection with that valuable letter, which he could not place, try as he would, seemed to have upset him entirely, so that he was no longer the same jolly Bumpus of old. "Which would you rather do today, Bumpus?" the scoutmaster asked. "Try and find these desperate men, and like as not get the whole of us into trouble? Or hunt for a bee tree with Allen, while Davy and myself go with Eli for a hunt?" There was no hesitation now, for with a wide grin Bumpus shouted, "Bee tree, first, last, and all time for mine!" "Ditto here," Giraffe followed by saying, as he laid a hand on the pit of his stomach, and bowed. "Can you make the try, Allen?" queried the stout scout, turning appealingly in the direction of the second in command of the patrol. "Do, for goodness' sake, oblige the little fellow," urged Giraffe, "because we'll sure hear of nothing else every hour of the day. When that feller gets a thing on his mind he makes me think of the woman in the sleeping car, who kept saying out loud in the night again and again, 'Oh, I am so thirsty! I am so thirsty!' till a traveler who couldn't sleep got up and went and gave her a cup of water. He was just trying to drop off again when she started in, and this time she kept saying, 'Oh, I was so thirsty! I was so thirsty!' Then he gave up trying to get a snooze till she tired out. And that's the way with Bumpus, boys." "But can't we make the try this morning, Allen?" persisted the stout boy, when the laugh at his expense had died away. "Better say yes, and save yourself a heap of trouble," suggested Step Hen, who was himself a little anxious to see how the search might be conducted. "Well," remarked Allen, "nothing can be done until about noon. If the sun seems fairly warm then, we might have a chance to see bees flying, or catch the drone of the swarm of young ones trying their wings just outside the opening of the tree hive. I'll set you all to work watching and listening, and we'll see who the lucky one will be." "Seems to me a lot of fellows make a living picking up things in these Maine woods, from honey and beeswax to lumbermen and pulp stuff choppers," Thad remarked, with an inquiring glance toward Allen. "They do," replied the other, promptly. "I could tell you a heap about these people, some of whom I've even met in my trips around." "Then go on and tell us," urged Davy. "Yes, we always like to know what's doing," added Giraffe, as he helped himself to another flapjack, which Jim, the younger guide, seemed to know how to make in a way calculated to appeal to a hungry camper's appetite. "Well, first of all, there's the spruce gum hunter," Allen started to say. "You can follow the snowshoe trail of these busy chaps through pathless stretches, and find their campfires glowing in many a lonely glen. They get about between $1 and $1.50 a pound for the stuff, and it's worth all of that. They usually travel in pairs, and collect many pounds in a season." "But how do they manage to climb some of these tall spruce trees we've seen on our trip?" asked Thad. "Oh, that's easy enough," laughed the other. "Every spruce gum hunter has a pair of climbers with him. You've seen the telephone and telegraph wiremen use these, fastened to their legs with straps. He has to have warm clothing, a curved chisel in the handle of which a pole is set, a fine jackknife, and a gun. In the night he sits by the fire smoking, while he cleans his day's pick. But he has to eat. Tell us then how he totes his grub along, and where does he put up at in the woods? We haven't run across any hotels up here, it strikes me," asked Giraffe. "As for his food," Allen continued, "he drags on a moose sled, and it's either a deserted camp, or the lee side of a tree every night as he happens to find things. And he is satisfied with mighty little in the way of food, trusting to his gun to eke things out. With plenty of work, a few bushels of beans, some flour and molasses, and perhaps some coffee, a gum picker thinks himself well off for a winter's campaign." "He must have a good eye for gum trees," suggested Thad. "Just what he has," replied the accommodating Allen. "A near-sighted gum hunter, or even a careless one, would miss many a chance to fill up his pack. The keen picker runs his eye along every trunk. Here and there he sees a tall spruce marked by a seam through which the sap has oozed, perhaps for years. The bubbles have crept out, and been clarified day by contact with sun and rain. There they are, nuggets of amber and garnet, ready for the picker's chisel. Sometimes he climbs up and taps away like a giant woodpecker. Then again, when it pays to do it, the tree is felled, for of course he has his axe along. No man would ever go into the Maine woods without that, you know." "If I was in that business," spoke up Bumpus, "tell you what I'd do." "Go on, then," said Giraffe, taking advantage of the fat boy's abstraction to pick the pancake off his plate, there being no more in the main dish. "Why, I'd just have a few acres of extra fine trees, and I'd scar 'em good and hard, so they'd bleed. Then, in a year or two, I'd just gather the gum like they do in the turpentine regions down south." "Good idea, Bumpus," declared Allan. "But another great man has thought of that same idea, which isn't copyrighted either. Every year this man, who is called the Spruce Gum King, takes a certain circuit and wounds the trees. Then, a couple of years afterwards, he wanders that way and reaps his harvest. There's another industry that gives employment to lots of men up here. That's gathering hoop poles." "Oh, tell us something about that," demanded Step Hen. "Well," Allan went on, "he follows in the wake of the logger, you might say, for he just wants the second growth that springs up around the stumps left after the tree is cut down. He takes what no one else seems to want, the young birch and ash sprouts that are too plentiful anyway. He takes a horse with him on his tours, for he has lots to tote. He hauls his day's cutting to camp, and spends the evening fixing the poles. It's pretty hard work, I'm told, all round, but then the evenings are pleasant, what with the crackle of the fire, the swish of the shaves at work taking the bark off the poles, the pipe smoking, and the story telling." "What do they get for the poles after they've been skinned?" asked Step Hen. "About 2 or 3 cents apiece, but that pays well for their work, and they bring in a heap of stuff through a winter. Of course, you know that these poles are split later, and used for barrels, the smaller ones for nail kegs, and to put around boxes. Down south all the orange boxes have such bindings." "Is that all the ways of earning a living up here in this wonderful country?" Thad asked, deeply interested. "I should say decidedly not," replied the other. "Why, I couldn't begin to tell you the different things men do up here, besides acting as guides, fire wardens to protect the woods, and logging. There's a professional honey hunter who spends most of his time summers in locating bee trees. Then there's the axe handle man. He needs ash of a larger growth than the hoop pole fellow. The trees are chopped in the fall, and then by means of a froe and an axe, each handle is shaped out in a rough state. Then they are buried, that they may season without cracking." "How funny that is," said Bumpus, who was listening to all this with eager ears. "For fear that the wood may split," continued Allan, "each end is daubed with a paint which is part grease, because ash goes to pieces mighty easy if the sun gets at it. The rough handles are sent away to a factory to be nicely finished. Then there's the fellow who hunts for ship knees, and I tell you he has no picnic. I tried it once, and I give you my word I don't want to go out again." "Ship knees?" echoed Giraffe. "Yes, and there are heaps of these picked up, but only after tough work. The prospector goes out with his axe, hunting for hack or back juniper, or tamarack. He must examine every one he finds to make sure it has just the right kind of a bend or crook. And then comes the job of digging it out, which is a muscle-racking business, believe me." "Any more?" demanded Bumpus, when Allan paused to finish his coffee. "Oh, yes, lots. I remember the fellow who goes after hemlock bark for the tanneries. Then there are the Indians who make baskets, or who prefer to have the old style birch bark canoe to one of these elegant up-to-date canvas ones that are built on exactly the same model as those used hundreds of years ago. Big birchers are few and far between up in Maine now, and sometimes, as Sebattis here has told me, one of the Penobscots will travel nearly 50 miles before he can strike a tree large enough to make a canoe, yielding a piece of bark without a crack, or a knothole, where a branch has been lopped off." "That winds up the list, then, doesn't it?" asked Step Hen, getting up. "Far from it," laughed Allan. "I could sit here for half an hour more, and tell you about other queer occupations that these wonderful Maine woods open up to the men who have a leaning that way. Why, I understand that some smart fellows have even been dredging some of the streams after the mussels or freshwater clams, and not only selling the shells to the factories where pearl buttons are manufactured, but finding pearls every little while." "Pearls! And up here of all places!" exclaimed Bumpus, as though amazed. "Certainly," replied Allan. "They've been taking a great many out in the streams of Indiana, Missouri, and other states in the Middle West these years back. And one man in the Moosehead region in Maine found a pearl not long ago that brought $200, and was worth many times that when polished, I guess. And then, last but not least, are the trappers who are scattered all over the state. Each winter they take a tremendous amount of valuable fur, and as Maine is so far north, the pelts being several times as much as those in warmer countries. A muskrat hide from a swamp up here is worth 3 times as much as one taken in Florida or Louisiana. But some other time I may tell you more about the resources of these great woods. It's time we got busy doing things, and here are Thad and Davy just waiting to be moving on their little hunt." "Well, I declare," remarked Bumpus, "I never had any idea the woods up here had such a lot of living in 'em for an army of men." And he looked around at the encircling trees with renewed respect. The little hunting party was soon ready to launch forth. "Be back before night, I suppose?" bawled out Giraffe after them. "We expect to," replied Thad. "But if we hold off, make your minds up we're all right, and don't let Bumpus worry." "Huh! Just as if Bumpus didn't have enough to worry about as it is," grumbled the fat boy. "I dreamed last night that when I got back to Cranford I found all my folks lined up at the station, and every blessed one a-pointing an accusin' finger right at me, and lookin' real sad. Say, I woke up all of a tremble, and was mighty glad to find that it was only a silly dream. Course, I must have delivered that note to the bank. Chances are 10 to 1 I did, but I wish I knew. I just wish I could be dead sure." He was a bit gloomy all through the morning, and sat there staring into the red heart of the fire until Giraffe demanded to know whether he was sick, and if he meant to go out with them after lunch to hunt for that bee tree, or keep camp. That seemed to excite Bumpus, and he again forgot all his troubles. But evidently his pondering had not brought any happy result, and he was just as far as ever from knowing whether he had carried out his father's instructions with regard to that precious letter or not. The sun had indeed warmed things up toward noon. It often does during the fall season in Maine, and before the first heavy snow making ideal weather, the early morning being crisp and delightful with the middle of the day quite warm. Allen had admitted that if ever they had a chance to find a bee tree, that day ought to tell the tale. He believed that the young bees would surely be tempted to take some exercise before they were hived up for the long winter. And when there is a swarm buzzing around busily in a clump, they make quite some noise that a keen ear can easily detect if on guard. So, after they had partaken of a light lunch, they started out, leaving Sebattis to look after the camp while they were gone. Besides an axe, the boys carried a few things in which a supply of honey could be brought back, in case success followed their efforts, and a genuine bee tree was located. Allen told them the comforting truth, that since this region had apparently not been hunted over for some years, there ought to be a very good chance of running across a hive. Of course they carried their guns, because no one could tell when these useful articles would be needed. And as Jim said, when a man wants his gun, he generally needs it in a big hurry. As they went along, Allen took occasion to point out numerous things that bore some relation to the facts which he had so recently been telling them. "That's a birch almost big enough to make a canoe," he remarked, pointing to a splendid specimen of the shapely tree that stood close by. "And over yonder is a tamarack on the border of that swale. You generally find them in swampy sections. And around this tree, blown down by a storm, you can see growing a lot of young shoots, which, as like as not, the hoop pole man would cut for his use." Presently, however, he began to explain how they must stretch out, forming a line through the woods and covering the ground. At one end Allen himself took up his station, with Jim the guide forming the other guard. This was a precaution, lest one of the others showed an inclination to stray. They were to keep in touch with one another by occasional shouts, which were to serve as signals. Each one had his particular and distinguishing call, and when Allen shouted, first Bumpus, next in line, then Step Hen, and after him Giraffe and Jim were to answer in order, that the one in charge could be sure that they were keeping in something of a straight line. And in case a hum was heard that sounded like a hive, a certain cry, twice repeated, was to summon all the others to the spot. The boys tramped for half an hour, with eyes and ears on the alert. Many times, no doubt, they imagined they caught the welcome buzzing sound, but upon coming to a halt in order to listen and make certain, before bringing their companions hurrying to the spot, It always devolved into something else, much to the chagrin and disappointment of the hunter. Bumpus was fully awake to the great possibilities of the occasion. Somehow this honey hunting had become a sort of mania with him. It was not that he loved the sweet nectar of the hive any better than Giraffe, for instance, but his nature was such that he liked to find things that were lost. And somehow the idea of locating a genuine bee tree appealed immensely to the fat boy. So he tramped sturdily along, looking upward with a great effort, on account of his stout build, and frequently wishing nature had endowed him with that rubber neck which Giraffe boasted, and which must be an ideal one for a wild honey hunter, Bumpus imagined. It was perhaps the first and only time he had ever envied his comrade in the possession of such a long neck. But Bumpus really believed that fortune was going to be extra kind to him. He kept telling himself that if any one discovered the wonderful bee tree, it must be himself, because he had dreamed of it so very often. Now and then he answered the calls which Allan sent out. He did this because he had a horror of getting lost. These woods seemed everlastingly big to him, and he could just imagine the terrible condition that must face any tenderfoot scout who managed to stray away from contact with his campmates. About 3/4 of an hour had gone now, and as yet no cry announcing the successful find had come pealing along the line. Bumpus was beginning to feel tired, without any question. He admitted it to himself, but grudgingly, for he did not want to halt the proceedings, now that they were actually engaged in the bee hunt. He refreshed himself at every water hole he came to, whether it were a running brook, or just a tiny pond with a thin skim of ice along the shore. They were passing through a rather thick patch of woods when Bumpus felt another thrill. He felt certain he had caught something that sounded like a buzzing of a swarm of insects; and as he had more than once meddled with the hive his people had at home, Bumpus was well qualified to know what the droning might be like. Eagerly did he look upward, all around him. Then he began to locate the quarter from which it seemed to come, and in so doing brought to bear what little woods lore he had managed to pick up. For he actually noted the direction of the slight breeze, and how the noise came to him more clearly as he moved to a certain point. Finally he believed it must come from one tree in particular. He made several tests, and each time his conviction grew more and more positive. And still the droning kept up. But the tree was a very tall one, and Bumpus had never trained his eyes to detect small objects at a distance. In fact, some of his friends had even declared that he must be nearsighted, though he stoutly denied this. Then suddenly he saw a confused blur between himself and the blue sky above the tops of the trees. It actually moved back and forth in a singular swaying way. Bumpus thrilled now with new pride. He fully believed that in this tall tree of the Maine woods he had actually located a beehive that would assure them all the clarified sweetness they could carry away. And when he had made as sure of this as he could, Bumpus put his trembling hands to his mouth, and sent out in his loudest tones the call agreed upon to tell the others that he, Bumpus, had after all been the one to succeed. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 16. A Little Knowledge Well Earned. "A false alarm, boys," sang out the envious Giraffe, as they all came hurrying up to the spot where Bumpus was dancing about excitedly, with a wide grin on his rosy fat face. "It is, hey?" declared the discoverer indignantly. "Well, you just wait and see what Allan here says. There's the tree it's in, and if you put on your specs, Giraffe, perhaps even you can see the swarm buzzing around up yonder." "He's right, boys," declared Allan quickly. "Even before I look, I can hear the noise that tells the truth. We found our bee tree, and the honor goes after all to our chum Bumpus." "Hurrah for Bumpus!" exclaimed Step Hen, pounding the fat scout on the back, after the custom of boys in general. They were all soon able to locate the buzzing sound, and gaped up with growing eagerness at the place where the swarm was in motion. "Looks like a big hive, too," ventured Giraffe. "You never can tell," Allan declared. "But from the signs I wouldn't be surprised if it was an old one, and just stocked to the doors with honey." "Wow, that suits me," Giraffe went on. "I can stand it every meal, right along. Never yet did get enough of the stuff." "But it's awful high up," ventured Step Hen. "How under the sun will we ever climb up there, and dig it out?" "Don't have to," remarked Bumpus, placidly. "That tree's just got to be chopped down, so's to let us scoop up all this stuff we can carry back home." "But it's a whopper of a tree," Step Hen went on. "And who's going to chop it down, I'd like to know?" "Oh!" remarked Bumpus, pleasantly. "That was all fixed long ago. You may remember that once Giraffe here promised to chop down the tree if ever I located a hive. Well, there's the tree, so get busy, Giraffe. It's a pretty hefty axe, too, I should think; but you know how to swing one. I'll sit down on this log, and see how you get on, 'cause I've done my part." Giraffe started to answer back, then thought better of it, and seizing hold of the axe that Jim the guide carried, he started to hack the tree. But Giraffe was no woodsman, and made such a sorry mess of it that Jim finally took pity on him. He knew the scout would never get that tree down in a day, judging from the clumsy way he started in. Besides, there would be danger of the amateur chopper bringing it down on himself. It takes an experienced woodsman to judge how a tree is inclined to fall. One of these fellows can drop a tree almost in any exact place he wants, unless the slant of the trunk is entirely too great to be overcome by judicious work with the axe. From time to time Allan spelled the guide, for he knew how to handle an axe to some advantage, and the others stood around, watching with interest the clever way in which the sharp axe cut into the wood, exactly on a line with preceding strokes. "I never could learn to do that in a coon's age," admitted Bumpus. "But I mean to, and before I quit these here Maine woods," declared Giraffe. "A feller that's as fond of fires as me ought to know how to chop down a tree, so's to always have plenty of wood for burnin'. And I can see the finish of these grand woods after you do learn how," remarked Step Hen, a little sarcastically. "You'll never rest as long as there's one tree left to burn." "Hey, she's shivering now. Better look out, fellers, because that tree's gonna come down right soon," called out Bumpus, edging away. After a little more work Jim made the rest all get back beyond the danger line, in case the tree did chance to swing around; which he knew would not be the case, because Jim had once been a logger, and doubtless felled hundreds of larger trees than this one. With a crash it came plunging down, just where the man with the axe had said he meant to drop it. "Whoop! Hurrah!" shrilled the excited Bumpus, who held a kettle in his hands; and carried away by the thrill of the moment, he forgot all the warning he had received from Allan, plunging straight toward the upper part of the tree. "Split wide open, fellers, and oh my! Just look at the honey spilled all over the ground. What a wicked waste! Oh! Oh!" "Come back from there!" shouted Jim. It was too late. Bumpus was in the midst of the excited swarm of bees that had started to whirl around, dazed at first by the sudden catastrophe that had overtaken their house, but rapidly becoming furiously angry. "Look at the silly, would you?" cried Step Hen, staring aghast at Bumpus, who had already started to fill his receptacle with the honeycomb that lay around, partly broken by the fall of the tree. "They're after him!" shrieked Giraffe, who thought it a comical sight to see the fat boy trying to gather up the sweet stuff with one hand, while the other was busily engaged slapping at the insects that began to get their work in on various parts of his anatomy. Finally, even the fortitude of Bumpus gave way before the onslaught of that army of angry bees, each member of which was armed with a sting that could make things exceedingly interesting for the intruder. So Bumpus began a masterly retreat. At first he clung to his spoils, and then, finding that he needed a dozen arms to ward off the savage little insects, he dropped his plunder, and set out on a wild run, kicking and slapping at a tremendous rate. Giraffe laughed heartily at the sight. He had advanced much further than the others before realizing that the example of Bumpus was reckless, and Step Hen's calling warned him to pull up. In the midst of his merriment Giraffe was seen to give a vicious lunge at the side of his head. This was followed by another and another, as more bees found him out, until with a yell he too had to seek safety in flight, his long arms waving every which way, like flails on a barn floor, or the wings of a Dutch windmill in action. It was a pair of very contrite boys that presently asked Allan's advice as to what was best for bee stings. Step Hen himself could not keep from grinning at the enlarged appearance of their heads, and even gave them some fatherly advice about the folly of being so conceited, and having such swelled heads over a little thing like that. But Allan found some mud on the border of a nearby pond, with which he plastered their hurts in the good old-fashioned way known to the early pioneers. After which there were two of the most comical-looking fellows ever seen wearing the uniform of Boy Scouts. All the same, the cool mud did seem to ease the terrible burning caused by the stings, and Allen said it would in a measure take out the poison. "No more rheumatism cures for me, I tell you," remarked Giraffe. "Whew! I guess the remedy is some worse than the disease. And can't those little beggars just poke it into you, though? Every time one stung me, I felt like he was pushing a 6-inch knife into me, and heated red hot at that. Honey, oh! Yes, I like you, but I'd rather bite in the market after this." "But don't think of giving up so soon," remarked Step Hen. "I'm dead sure Allen here knows of a way to get all the honey we want, and never be stung once. Don't you, Allen?" "I'll show you how it's done," replied the other. "Though in the summer time the bee hunters often carry a piece of mosquito netting along, which they fasten over their hats, so the insects can't get at them. But there's another way. Bees are in deadly fear of smoke. All bee men give them a few puffs of smoke before they open the hive." "What does that do? Stupefy the poor little critters?" asked Step Hen, who did not know as much about bees as even Bumpus. "Why, you see," volunteered the latter, wishing to air his knowledge, "bees, as soon as they sense smoke, believe their hive is on fire. Every feller gets busy right away, loading up with honey. And when they're doing that, they won't take any notice of other things, so they can be handled easy enough. I know something about bees, because we got a new-fangled hive at home." "Huh! I guess you know more about 'em right now than ever you did before, Bumpus," chuckled Step Hen, who had not been stung once. "And it's been impressed on you pretty strong, too, so's to keep you from forgetting the same. After this you ain't agoin' to romp into a hive of bees that's been upset, not in a hurry." "Allen, suppose you get busy with that smoke," remarked Bumpus, disdaining to appear to notice this slur on his capacity for bee lore. "We'd better wait a little longer," the other advised, "so we can get closer. They'll quiet down in a little while, and then we can make the fire on the windward side, so that the smoke must drift right across the hive." Presently he set them to work collecting just the kind of fuel he wanted, and which was calculated to make a dense smoke. When this smudge was started going, it seemed to set the bees working with feverish eagerness to load themselves down with honey. No one ever has learned just why they do this, unless it is the desire to save enough food for self-support, because they never attempt to rescue any of the young brood in the cells. "Ain't it near time now?" asked the impatient Bumpus, whom even the swollen condition of his neck and cheeks did not seem to entirely cure of that eager desire to snatch the fruits of his victory from the savage little army of protectors. "A little longer, and then we can set to work. Better let Jim and me do the main part of it, boys. You might be too excited, and it's always that kind of a fellow the bees tackle. I've known beekeepers who handle their hives day in and day out all season, and seldom get a sting. They're cool, and never make a false move, such as knocking the box, or coughing, or any sort of sound that will anger the insects." He went on to tell them some interesting facts connected with the finding of bee trees, which he had either heard from the lips of others, or witnessed himself. 10 minutes passed, and Bumpus was growing impatient again, when Allen remarked: "Now, the time is up, I guess. And if you keep back of us, and hand us the buckets, Jim and myself can begin to get some of that clear stuff, which looks like this season's make. It won't take only a little time till we fill everything we brought, and there must be a ton of the stuff all told in this big old hive." Even Giraffe forgot his late unpleasantness, as he again advanced nearer the spot where the stores of scattered sweetness lay. Chapter 17 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 17. The Coming of the Hairy Honey Thief. It did not take long for the honey gatherers to fill every receptacle they had brought along with them. Bumpus was once more feeling a little like himself, though Step Hen did take occasion to warn him against showing his pride over being the one to find the bee tree. "Honors are about even, I guess, Bumpus," he would remark, with stinging emphasis. "You found the bees, and they found you all right, looks like. and you're swelled up enough now without letting yourself puff out any more. We all admit that you're a wonder, and that you've sure got an eye for bee trees, just as Giraffe here is crazy about the stuff. Look at him now, would you, munching at that comb just like it was a slice of bread and jam." "Yum, yum," remarked the person in question, whose face was smeared almost up to his ears with the sticky stuff. "Ain't had such a delicious feed since I sneaked into the preserve closet at home when a kid, and the spring lock caught. I knew I'd be in for a tannin', and was bound to get the worth of it first, so I just ate and ate, trying to sample every kind there was. It made me sick, though, which was worse than the strappin' my dad gave me. But this is the finest ever, barring none. Yum, yum, and more to follow, too." "Well, if I was like that, I'd just camp out alongside this old nest till I'd scraped it clean, if it took all winter," declared Step Hen, who did not happen to care particularly for sweet things, and therefore felt no sympathy for the other pair of scouts. Bumpus had also tasted his find, and pronounced it prime. They could hardly coax Giraffe away from the fallen bee tree, and in securing a last comb of the lovely clear honey, he managed to get a few more stings that rather added to his ridiculous appearance. Step Hen nearly took a fit every time he looked at that pair, nor could Allen blame him, for they certainly were a sight calculated to make any one forget all his own troubles. The afternoon wore away, and those who remained in camp talked over the next thing which was on the program. This was nothing more nor less than making an effort to bag a bear, and of course Giraffe was particularly interested, because of the boast he had made in Cranford that he did not mean to return home until he had, alone and unaided, shot a black bear. "There was sure enough smell of honey in the air around that old bee tree to set a bear crazy for a taste, if he ever got wind of the treat," declared Allen, when Giraffe asked him for the 5th time about the chances they had of meeting with Bruin. "Mebbe he's over there now, fillin' up?" suggested Bumpus, who was not very much interested, because he could not be coaxed to go all the way back to where they had secured their store of sweets, even though sure of seeing a bear diving into the honey tree, and stowing away great quantities of the sticky stuff. "No, it isn't likely he's abroad in the daytime," Allen replied. "He got something of a scare when we chased him out of here, and I guess he's lying snug in some old hollow where he can take up his quarters for the winter. But when night comes I think he'll venture out, and once he does he'll sniff that scent a mile away, for a bear, like all wild animals, has a great nose for odors." "Then we don't need to go out till after supper?" suggested Giraffe. "Glad about that, too, because I'm some tired." "I should think you would be," Step Hen put in maliciously, "after that great sprint you did when the little busy bees tried to hand you their cards. If you could only make that fast time in a schoolboy race, you'd be a wonder, Giraffe." "Huh! Glad you think so, Step Hen," grunted the other. Time passed on. The afternoon waned, and supper was cooking; but as yet the absent scouts, with old Eli along, had not returned. "No use waiting for 'em any longer, fellers," remarked Giraffe, who, as the shadows gathered, was anxious to be off, for fear lest the bear get to the honey tree, and secure a full supply before they arrived. "Anyhow, we need not be bothered about Thad, who knows how to get around, even if he has to stay out all night," declared Step Hen. "Besides, they've got old Eli along, and what he don't know about the Maine woods you could put in a thimble," remarked Bumpus, not at all averse to attacking the supper Jim had cooked, and which seemed to have a splendid odor. Accordingly they sat down, and hurried through the meal. Giraffe kept urging Allen and Jim to hurry up, and in consequence they were all done before it was actually dark. Giraffe took special pains to look his big rifle over before starting, for he wanted to be able to depend on it when the time came for business. Doubtless the boy could not quite forget the slurs that had been cast on his father's weapon, when the new up-to-date repeater with its mushroom bullets had given such a good account of itself at the time of the killing of the moose, and he was fully determined that he would equal the score Thad had set, if given a chance. Jim declared he could lead them straight to the fallen bee tree, and Allen seemed to put full confidence in the guide, so they set forth. Sebattis, Step Hen, and Bumpus was left behind, to guard the camp and the canoes. Perhaps it would seem a long way to Giraffe, for he had gone through considerable since daybreak; and those bee stings must have robbed him of more or less energy. But the prospect of big game buoyed up his spirits, and he trudged along with the other two, changing his heavy gun occasionally from one shoulder to the other, in order to rest himself. "Smells pretty strong of honey, I must say," he muttered after they had been moving quite some time. This was doubtless intended to be put out as a feeler, and it worked well, too, for Allen immediately remarked: "Nearly there, Giraffe. A few minutes more, and you'll see the tree we cut down." "D'ye think he can be there?" whispered the long scout, nervously fingering the lock of his rifle, as he peered ahead into the gloom of the night, possibly seeing a bear rearing up on his hind legs every time he got sight of a dim tree before him. "Jim says no, he hasn't come yet," replied Allen, also allowing his voice to sink, for although they were coming up to windward of the bee tree, it was better to be doubly cautious. Presently they arrived on the spot, and found all quiet. Bruin had evidently not reached the scene, though both Jim and Allen were just as positive as ever that the old fellow would be along before a great while. So Jim selected the place where they would lie in wait. It was close enough to the broken bee hive to afford Giraffe a splendid chance for a shot. Allen had made sure to fetch along the little electric hand torch belonging to Thad. This he meant to manipulate himself, and believed it would be all that was necessary to catch the attention of the honey-eating bear, and hold him in surprise until Giraffe could take aim and pull trigger. After that they had to remain very quiet indeed, lest some incautious movement warn the bear of their presence. Jim had seen to it that both the boys had dressed warmly, even donning sweaters for the occasion, since it is a shivery job to sit for 1 or more hours of a cold night, hardly daring to move. The blood seems to become congealed in the veins with the inaction, and once a shiver passes over the frame, the teeth start to chattering even against all will power. When an hour had gone, Giraffe began to grow tired. He was more or less apt to show impatience, at any rate, and had not learned the lesson of controlling his boyish desire to have things happen quickly. Allen was just on his left, holding the torch ready for action, and by leaning that way Giraffe could speak in the lowest of whispers. "This is getting tough," he admitted. "Keep standing it a while longer," came in reply. "But do you really think he'll come along yet?" asked Giraffe, disconsolately, as he pictured Bumpus and Step Hen sitting so snugly beside the glowing fire he loved so much. "Both Jim and I think the chances are the old fellow's on the way right now," answered the comforter. "All right, then, I'll just try to stand it a while longer. But I hope my hands don't tremble this way when I come to shoot," Giraffe went on to say. "Keep your gun resting on the log, just like I showed you," said Allen. "That way it won't much matter if you are shivering. And be sure and shoot just as soon as you're certain you've got his shoulder covered. I won't butt in unless I think he's going to get away. Now close up again, Giraffe." Silence once more rested on the scene. More minutes passed by, 5, 10, 15 dragging along. Giraffe was just about to touch Allen on the arm again, and tell him he really could not stand it, he was so cold, when he heard a strange little sound that made him forget all about it. In a second, it seemed, his heart got to pounding away at such a lively rate that he actually felt hot all over. Was that a real sniff sniff that came to his ears? He strained his hearing, and caught it more plainly now, and besides he could detect a shuffling sound, such as would indicate the presence of a large body moving along. It approached the scene of the wrecked tree hive, and a minute later, while Giraffe almost held his breath with anxiety, he caught other sounds that told him the hairy honey thief had set to work gulping down the scattered combs so full of sweetness, with a greed that even excelled his own love for the product of the hive. Apparently it was about time something were doing, unless they meant to allow the bear to fill himself with the honey, in the hope that while in this condition he might fall an easier prey. Then came a nudge in the side from Allen. Giraffe knew what this meant. He had been warned that when the time for action had arrived, Allen would give him such a dig, and that he was to prepare to take aim and fire, for the little electric torch would flash immediately afterward. All of a sudden the bear gave a snort. The intense darkness had been dispelled by a brilliant ray of light. Well had Allen judged the location of the honey thief, for Giraffe could instantly see the bear standing there with upraised head, staring straight toward the point from whence that mysterious light sprang. His side was fortunately toward them. Giraffe thought it looked almost as big as the famous red barn, and as he glanced along the extended barrel of his father's rifle he tried to control his nerves. "Shoot!" came in a shrill whisper from Allen, who feared lest the other might be so panic-stricken that he could not pull the trigger. And obeying the injunction, Giraffe did shoot, the crash of the rifle being almost immediately drowned in a terrible roar that burst forth. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the Boy Scouts on the Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts on the Trail by Herbert Carter. Chapter 18. A Mighty Nimrod. Again! Give him another shot! Giraffe heard this shouted close to his ear, and mechanically working the pump action of the heavy repeating rifle which his father had carried for quite some years on his hunting trips up in the Adirondacks, he again fired. "Once more, quick! You've got him going, but he's getting up again!" cried Allen, and so Giraffe did as he was told. Then he did not see the black hairy mass move any more, though he could hardly believe that he had done what he had expressed such a great ambition to accomplish. Shoot a real black bear in his native wilds. "Good! You've finished him, Giraffe!" exclaimed Allen, reaching for the quivering hand of his chum, which he squeezed most heartily. "I'm ever so glad I didn't have to butt in and spoil it all. That's your game for keeps, Giraffe. You've got to cut a notch in the stock of your gun after this, because you're no longer a greenhorn. Come along, and let's see what he looks like." The bear was undoubtedly dead. That last bullet had evidently finished him, although very likely he would never have left that spot after receiving the first and second shots. "Whew! But ain't he a buster, though?" ejaculated the delighted hunter, as he cautiously felt of one of the forepaws of the animal. "We ought to get him out of this before morning," said Allen, "because the bees will apt to make it good and warm for us, if we poke in here by daylight. Let's all get hold, and see if we can't budge the old critter." They found it all they were able to do, to move the bear a few inches at a time. But once clear of the branches of the trees, the task proved easier. By throwing all their weight into each pull, as Jim sang out, "Yo, heave ho!" they finally managed to get the prize where they wanted him. "How about leaving him here through the night, Jim?" asked Allen. "I'd say as how it were safe, if it hadn't been for that howl we heard last night," replied the guide. "If so be wolves is around, they'd clean up his carcass right smart between now and daylight." "Oh, but I want that hide the worst kind," declared Giraffe. "Why, whoever'd believe me if I couldn't show the skin of the bear I shot?" Jim took out his knife and felt the edge. "Somebody make a fire so I can see, and we'll fix things afore the hour goes past," he said simply. "Let me do it, Allen. You know nobody knows how to build fires as well as I do," Giraffe exclaimed, laying his gun aside. He was as good as his word, and had a splendid fire working inside of a very few minutes. The Maine guide was already busily engaged, and Giraffe watched him taking the bear's hide off with more than common interest. For was it not his bear, and did he not have the right to feel proud? Why, if he had shot poorly, the big beast, rendered savage through pain, might have charged the party, and then there would have been plenty of excitement. Even Allen might have missed, since he could hardly manage to see while trying to hold the torch and his rifle at the same time, and there would be no telling what must have happened. After Jim had very deftly taken the hide off, he started in to carve up some of the carcass, taking the choicest portions. For they could only carry a certain amount with them, and the wolves or foxes were quite welcome to the balance. Indeed, from the grin on Jim's face as he used his knife, Allen fancied that the bear was bound to prove about as tough as a moose. But then, hungry boys can masticate what would prove a difficult task to one whose teeth were less sharp. And besides, as that was Giraffe's bear, of course it would taste especially fine to him. "Where'd I hit him, Jim?" Giraffe asked after a time. "One shot took him on the shoulder," said Allen, before the guide could reply. "I think that must have been your first. It kind of knocked him over. Then, as he was getting up again, you gave him a second clean through the heart. He kicked after that, but could never have done you any hurt. That was a dandy shot, fired at the time he was moving, too. The last one came in his side, and didn't amount to so much. But taken in all, you did finely, Giraffe. It speaks well for your nerve." "Huh!" grunted the other, who was plainly pleased by Allen's words, nevertheless. They always did own I had plenty of nerve, you know. Eli Bangs said I had, when I stepped up and took his best girl away from him at that school dance we held out in Epley's big barn last winter." "Got enough, Jim?" asked Allen, as the guide wiped his knife and put it back in the leather sheath at his belt. "All we can carry," replied the other, "and perhaps twice as much as we'll eat, I reckons. If so be them wolves is still around, let 'em come ter the feast. I'd like ter get a crack at one of the critters myself. A wolf I never yet shot, 'cause you see they've been so scarce ever since I got to totin' a gun." "Well, we might as well head back to the cabin," Allen remarked. "I see you've made that up in 2 packs, Jim, the hide in one and the meat in the other?" "Yep, I thort as how he'd like to carry the skin, 'cause it's his'n. I'll tackle the bundle of bear meat." And the guide slung the heavy load up across his back, with the air of one accustomed to making trips across many a carry, toting boats, duffel, and bedding, as well as tents. "All right, that leaves the 3 guns to me, and if either of you get tired, why, just call on me to take a turn. You'll find me willing," said Allen. But that did not happen. Jim was tough and accustomed to doing all sorts of burden bearing in his work as a guide, summer and winter, year in and year out. And as for Giraffe, catch him asking anybody else to lug his bearskin along, so long as he was able to put one foot before the other. He may have grunted from time to time, but when Allen asked if he wanted any assistance, Giraffe indignantly denied being weary, and so he carried that heavy green hide all the way to camp. When they arrived at the cabin, they could see by the light through the window that those within still kept the fire going, evidently anticipating the arrival of the bear hunting expedition. They jumped up as the 3 new arrivals entered, and seeing their packs, with the long black hair of the pelts showing plainly, Step Hen and Bumpus were especially vociferous in their congratulations. Allen noticed one thing as soon as he had taken his first peep into the cabin. This was that Thad, Davy, and Eli had not come back as yet. But he saw no reason to be worried. Thad had taken the pains to notify them that possibly he and his companions might be away longer than a single day, and if they failed to show up after night set in, perhaps they would stay out a second day. "That settles one thing, anyway," remarked Bumpus. "We ain't going to starve, as long as we have such mighty hunters as Thad and Giraffe along with us, even if the meat is tough." "It settles a number of things," remarked Giraffe, fastening his eagle eye, as Bumpus liked to term those orbs of the tall scout, severely on Step Hen. "Oh, I know what you're talking of now," declared the other, quickly. "It's all about that rifle of your dad's, and how it can shoot. Now, I never said that it couldn't do the trick all right. Goodness knows it's heavy enough for anything. It was you always poking fun at my little 30-30, and calling it a pop gun, a squirt gun, and all such things. But I take notice, with all that's said, it took just 3 bullets for you to kill that poor bear, that was nearly ready to turn up his toes and die from old age. When Thad, he just fired once, and gave a bull moose in a fighting frame his walking papers. And think how much easier to tote a light gun like mine 20 miles a day. Ask Jim here, and he'll tell you he means to get one like mine the next time he finds $30 in the road. I suppose that bear is tough, but don't you say a thing about him being so old he would have soon kicked the bucket. You know better than that, Step Hen. Don't all of us believe that this is the same bear we chased out in the cabin here, only last night, and say, what did he do to you and Bumpus? Seems to me you wanted us all to know that you'd been thrown 10 or 20 feet outside the door, when that poor weakly old sinner, as you call him, just breezed past you. Now, that will be quite enough from you, Step Hen. The tougher he was, the more glory for the feller that shot him." After this broadside from Giraffe, the other scout relapsed into silence. Indeed, he could find nothing to say. "It's getting pretty late, seems to me," Bumpus remarked, with a yawn. "Yes, it is, for kids," added Giraffe, a little contemptuously; for somehow Step Hen had aroused his fighting blood, and he seemed to have a chip on his shoulder, daring any one to knock it off. "But what's the use waiting up to see if Thad gets back?" argued the short scout. "There's no use at all," remarked Allen, just then, "because I think I hear them coming along right now. How about it, Sebattis?" "3 come, Thad, Davy, Eli," replied the Indian, gravely; for Allen had first had his attention called to the slight sounds without by noticing that Sebattis was sitting with his head cocked in a listening attitude. "I'd like to understand how he knows that. muttered Giraffe, who had edged over toward the corner where his gun stood, as though a little suspicious of the identity of those who were even now at the door. For he remembered that there were exactly 3 of those lawless hoboes loose in the woods and not far away. But immediately the door opened to admit Thad, and after him came Davy, while the weather-beaten face of the old Maine guide, Eli Crooks, showed up in the rear. Each of the 3 hunters carried some sort of burden, though not of any great size, Allan noticed. These they tossed down in a corner, with the air of being more or less tired from a long tramp. And Allan, accustomed to reading faces more than might the average boy, believed that he saw something like a frown upon all 3 countenances, that certainly must have been caused by something besides fatigue. "Venison?" questioned Giraffe, just itching to have the newcomers ask what luck had fallen to the share of the bee hunters, when he could hold up that prized bearskin, and tell how he alone had shot the monster Bruin. "Yes, what little of it was left to us," replied Davy, crossly. "Why, whatever happened?" demanded Bumpus. "I wonder now, did you run across any of those savage wolves we heard howling last night?" "Oh, not much," replied Thad, smiling. "That would have been a picnic for us. But we had an experience that beat that all hollow. Fact is, we were fired at by some of those hoboes who are up here in the woods for their health and safety." CHAPter 19.